The calliope music sounded cheerful, as it had done for 38 years in Meadowbrook City Park. Samuel Tate, known to every child in the city as Sammy, pulled the brass lever, and painted horses jumped up and down. Their manes were chipped, and their saddles rubbed, but to Sammy they were alive. Sammy was a tall, old man with a silver beard, and a stooped back that ached from the morning hours. Still, every time he heard happy children's voices nearby, he would forget about the pain. That carousel was his world, his pride and joy. He knew every horse's name, and he knew how much oil he had to add to their joints and how many coats of paint he had to give them. "You coming, Sammy?" Little Emily Turner shouted, jumping excitedly on her favorite white horse. "You bet I am, sweetheart." Sammy smiled broadly, his voice like warm coffee. "Hold on tight." That day was a beautiful September afternoon, when the whole park was filled with families. Mothers sat on the park benches, watching their children run around the carousel. Sammy stood nearby, handing out tickets to whoever wanted to ride on horses in colorful costumes. He took them from his old leather pouch with care, remembering every child that had done that. But the next thing he knew, black SUVs had arrived, and 3 of them surrounded the carousel. First, the dark-windowed cars let out 2 men in suits, and then Julian Cross came out as a billionaire. He wore a $10,000 suit and greeted the gathered children. Sammy looked at him in confusion as Cross approached the park's fountain, flanked by his lawyers. "Good people of Meadowbrook," Julian proclaimed loudly, gesturing at the carousel. "I have bought this park, and soon this place will be turned into Cross Luxury Towers." The crowd gasped in horror as mothers pulled their children close to them. Sammy's heart stopped as he realized what the man was saying. "First of all, this carousel has been here since 1920, Sammy said firmly, stepping forward. "Second, this place has been kids' favorite hangout spot since it was opened. And last but not least, those horses are my pride and joy." "Your pride and joy," Julian sneered, signaling his men to approach the carousel. "This man is spinning horses while I earn fortunes by building luxury buildings in this city. This carousel is garbage, and I will take it down." "Oh, wait," Sammy shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of chains being thrown over the carousel. His heart sank as he watched his beloved horses tied down by thick steel ropes, his hands trembling with rage. The children cried, and Sammy looked at the faces of worried and angry parents. "I will tear this down," Julian said, looking at the crowd. "If you want this city to develop, it needs to give way to progress." Sammy turned to the angry parents, his tired eyes searching theirs. He saw the disappointment, frustration, and most importantly, hopelessness. He watched as Julian walked away, victorious in his mission. That night, Sammy sat in his small apartment, opening a wooden chest at the foot of his bed. He pulled out thousands of tiny pieces of paper, each one a ticket stub for the rides on his carousel. His hands shook as he sorted through them, carefully picking out the ones he remembered from long ago. Suddenly, his eyes fell on one of the tickets from 1985, and he frowned. Sammy's tired eyes narrowed as he held the yellow paper closer. He traced the smudged fingerprint at the end, and his heart raced. If his memory served him right, that was the ticket his father had bought that night. "You should not have done that, Mr. Cross," Sammy muttered to himself, still staring at the ticket. 3 days later, the park gates were closed and locked, and Sammy walked past the carousel every morning, his heart breaking at the thought of children's cries. They peered through the chain that now surrounded the fountain, asking when they would be able to go there. Sammy had no answer, and Julian had taken that from him too. But Sammy was a persistent old man. While the park's gates were closed, he visited the local library every night, poring over the old microfilm newspapers. He searched every issue of the newspaper dating back to 1985, trying to find any mention of that fateful night. He smiled grimly as he recalled that night, and a certain memory stood out in his mind. A tall man had arrived at the Carousel, wearing a long coat and bringing his young son with him. The boy's name, Sammy realized, was Julian Cross. The man's name was his father, Marcus Cross. And that night, Marcus had met with an unknown investor at the Carousel. Sammy's fingers tightened around the microfilm as he stared at the page before him. There was an article, small but still visible, that mentioned how Marcus Cross had suddenly gained great wealth after meeting with an investor. He had opened his own real estate company and bought several luxury buildings from him. 6 months later, federal agents had quietly dropped the investigation into his money laundering, citing a lack of evidence. Sammy closed his eyes for a moment, his granddaughter's voice echoing in his ears. She had just graduated from law school, and he had called her the next day. "Are you all right, Grandpa?" Jessica asked him with concern. "Did something happen?" "There is something I would like you to do for me," Sammy replied. "I need you to find something for me. I need you to investigate a man who ruined all of our lives." Her voice softened as Jessica listened to him. She knew who he was talking about, and she agreed to do what she could. Jessica called in a few favors from her friends, and one of them, an FBI agent named Miller, agreed to help. The next day, they met at a coffee shop, and Miller looked at the ticket with interest. "It's a miracle that this fingerprint is even here," Miller muttered, putting on gloves. "If this turns out to be whose fingerprint it is, Sammy, it would be enough evidence to convict that man." Sammy's hands trembled with excitement. "Then take it, son. I have waited a long time for justice to be served." That night, Sammy walked through the park one last time before delivering the evidence to the FBI. He stopped near the Carousel, running his hand along the chain that surrounded it. He stared at the horses that had brought him so much joy and smiled slightly. "They took something special from all of us," Sammy whispered to the horses in the moonlight. "But they did not take one thing from me. They did not take the memories from me that will burn in my heart forever. They did not take that one thing from the ordinary people who keep this country running. The one thing that has been destroying rich men like Julian Cross for decades." 2 weeks later, Julian sat in his penthouse, sipping brandy and reviewing the blueprints for his luxury towers. Someone knocked on the door, and his personal assistant came in without asking. "Julian, we have a problem," the man said grimly. "The FBI froze all our accounts." "You what?" Julian asked, nearly spitting out his drink. "What do they want?" "They are investigating the money laundering from your father's case," his assistant replied. "They have enough evidence to convict you." Julian choked on his brandy, his heart pounding in his chest. He dropped the glass to the floor, staring at his assistant in horror. The next thing he knew, the whole town was talking about it, and the local news was buzzing with excitement. Sarah Jenkins, a famous investigative journalist, stood outside his penthouse, waiting for him. Her camera crew had followed him all the way there. "What do you have to say about it?" Sarah demanded as Julian opened the door. "You are wrong," Julian said coldly. "This is nonsense. That old man's nonsense has nothing to do with me. Did your father commit the same crime when he was mayor?" Sarah asked pointedly. "Did he launder money as well?" Julian turned red and left. The next thing he knew, he was back in his penthouse, and Sarah was still there. Her crew filmed, as he paced furiously from room to room. "He took something from all of us," Julian said bitterly. "He took my chance to build this city on my own." "You're wrong," Sarah said. "The truth was right here in front of your nose all this time, Julian. The evidence that would convict you was tucked away by your father in that carousel for 38 years. "Get out," Julian growled, pointing at the door. "You're wasting my time." Sammy watched as Sarah Jenkins left the penthouse, his granddaughter by his side. Jessica squeezed his shoulder reassuringly as he looked at the cameras. "He did it, Grandpa." "You did it," Jessica whispered. "No, sweetheart. The truth did it. All I did was keep a small piece of paper that was special to me. All I did was keep it safe." That night, agents from the FBI arrested Julian Cross and charged him with fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. His assets were frozen, and the park was transferred to the city's ownership. The chain around the carousel was cut the next day, and hundreds of families came to the park to enjoy the horses. Sammy sat nearby, smiling as the calliope music sounded. On a crisp October morning, the park's gates were opened, and hundreds of families entered. Children ran toward the carousel, laughing and chatting. Sammy stood in the center, handing out tickets to whoever wanted to ride on horses in colorful costumes. He watched as the calliope music sounded, the horses moved, and the children's voices grew louder. But just as the first young girl entered the carousel, a procession of FBI cars arrived. Julian Cross got out, his hands cuffed, and the crowd fell silent. He gave Sammy a strange look as the agents led him away. It was the same look he had given the parents who had yelled at him 2 months earlier. "Mr. Cross," Sarah Jenkins shouted, pointing her camera at him. "What are you going to say to the people who came to the carousel to ride on those horses?" Julian turned to face the crowd. "It's nonsense," he said angrily. "An old man's nonsense. I built this city with my own hands. Did your father do the same?" Sarah asked pointedly. "Did he build this city with his own hands?" Julian's face turned red, and he turned away. The crowd roared in approval as the agents led him away. Agents from the FBI pushed him toward the waiting cars, and he looked back at the carousel one last time. Sammy was standing there, his silver beard glowing in the morning sun. "Sammy," Julian muttered, "you and your stupid tickets ruined my life." Sammy stepped forward and looked at the billionaire in the eyes. "Your life was not worth much if it was built on lies," he said quietly. "Every ticket I sold was precious to me. Every child who rode on my carousel filled that spot in my heart. You should have known that. But you did not." The crowd cheered as Julian was forced into the car. The next thing he knew, he was being pushed toward the other cars. He looked back at the carousel one last time, and a strange expression crossed his face. "Thank you," Julian whispered. Sammy watched as the cars drove away, and the park gates opened for another day. He gave his famous speech to the crowds of children, smiling as they jumped up and down on the horses. "I'm just a humble man," Sammy said. "I am proud to be a part of this carousel, but most importantly, I am proud to be an everyday American. I learned one important lesson, and I want to share it with all of you. Never give up your dreams or your memories, for they will always lead you home."